This episode is sponsored in part by our friends at AWS App Config. Engineers love to solve and occasionally create problems, but not when it's an on-call fire drill at 4 in the morning. Software problems should drive innovation and collaboration, not stress and sleeplessness and threats of violence. That's why so many developers are realizing the value of AWS App Config feature flags. Feature flags let developers push code to production, but hide that feature from customers so that the developers can release their feature when it's ready. This practice allows for safe, fast, and convenient software development. You can seamlessly incorporate app config feature flags into your AWS or cloud environment and ship your features with excitement, not trepidation and fear. To get started, go to snark.cloud/appconfig. That's snark.cloud/appconfig. I've been beating Azure up a fair bit lately, which is no great surprise to anyone who's a regular listener to this podcast. A friend of mine mentioned over drinks that she thinks of Azure as the boomer cloud, at which point I spat my own drink out and immediately knew what I had to do. Build something on Google Cloud Functions. To the Cloud Console I go. Now, I think of Google Cloud Functions more or less as AWS Lambda with Google branding. That's my baseline starting point because AWS has first mover advantage in cloud. Now, unlike AWS, which hurls you into a morass of options that assumes you know what you're doing, the wizard that Google Cloud offers is pretty straightforward. It starts by asking whether I want to use the first generation or second generation function options. A quick perusal of the differences shows me that this is pretty typical for a Google offering. Generation 1 is deprecated, while Generation 2 is in beta. Given that I'm a sysadmin historically, I bias for old and busted over new hotness, so Generation 1 it is. Next, it asks me what to call it, which is easy since I'm not about to delegate naming anything to a cloud provider based solely upon its track record of screwing that very specific thing up. It also asks me what region to put this in, which I absolutely don't care about in the slightest, so I accept the default on the theory that they wouldn't suggest something that's currently on fire. The next thing it cares about is the trigger for the function. I'm met with 8 potential options, 4 of which are marked preview in the drop-down menu. At this point, I want a function that's going to fire off every 5 minutes or so, and none of the various options presented seem to grant that. A bit of Googling shows that Google has taken a page from AWS's playbook on this. The right approach is to set up a job in Google Cloud Scheduler to fire every 5 minutes. It'll then toss a message onto a Google PubSub queue, which can be consumed as a Cloud Function trigger. I admit, I cringed at this. AWS has taught me that whenever you have to cross service team boundaries like this, the experience is going to absolutely suck for you. I was therefore thrilled to learn that apparently Google doesn't have internal policies against one service team talking to another service team every once in a while, and all this took a few clicks in the console to set up. I accepted the defaults for the rest of it and moved on to the code portion. I was greeted immediately by a boilerplate skeleton of a function and a dropdown of which language runtime I want to use. There are a sarcastic number of options, so I went with Python 3.10. At this point, the infrastructure is basically set. It's time for me to write some crappy Python to make all of this do something useful. That didn't take very long to bang out because what I want is relatively simple. Whenever Microsoft Azure's Twitter account tweets something that isn't a retweet or a reply, I want the function to trigger my bot to quote tweet Azure's tweet in all caps, along with the kind of commentary that you'd generally expect to come from what appears to be Azure's target market. Boomers. I stored the Twitter API credentials in the Google Cloud Functions environment variables section, but then I was left with a problem. Once this horrible bot has tweeted about an Azure tweet, I don't want it to tweet about that one again. So where do I store the single piece of state for this entire application? The ID of the last tweet that it saw. This episode is sponsored in part by our friends at Sysdig. Sysdig secures your cloud from source to run. They believe, as do I,
that DevOps and security are inextricably linked. If you want to learn more about how they view this, check out their blog. It's definitely worth the read. To learn more about how they are absolutely getting it right from where I sit, visit sysdig.com and tell them that I sent you. That's SYSDIG.com. And my thanks to them for their continued support of this ridiculous nonsense.
This is a deceptively complex problem, and none of the cloud providers have a differentiated answer for this. Every option I explore requires at least one of two things. I either have to set up a whole means of accessing a different subsystem to retrieve the tweet ID, and or I have to store API credentials for a third-party service to hold that data itself. One horrible idea that occurred to me was to use a second Twitter account as a database and simply have it tweet out the string of the tweet ID I care about. After all, I already have all the Tweepy Python libraries integrated into this app. I dismissed this idea as nearly as deranged as using Route 53 as a database and opted instead for Google's Cloud Firestore option. This is a NoSQL document database that does an awful lot of stuff that I really could not care less about, but it also takes a key and returns a value, which is all I really want. The shining jewel here is that because both Firestore and my Cloud Function are in the same Google Cloud project, by default, the security permissions just worked without me having to strike a deal with the devil. I wasn't expecting that at all, and I'm absolutely enchanted by the experience. As of this recording, the unsolved problem that remains is that I haven't gotten Google Cloud repositories to properly sync code from my GitHub repository correctly. So I'm reduced to copying and pasting code in like some kind of monster from 1998. But all things considered, it was a delightful development experience that I'd absolutely recommend to someone who's starting out. And if you care about what Azure is doing, you should absolutely keep up with the antics of my new Cloud Boomer bot account, which, if you've gotten this far with my nonsense, will no doubt tickle your fancy.
This has been a Humble Pod production. Stay humble.